Welcome back to the third hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you. Johann Hari is the author of Lost Connections, a new book. The subtitle is The Science Behind Depression Exposed. His previous book, Chasing the Scream, kind of got close to some of these topics. And after the suicide of Anthony Bourdain, in fact, there's been kind of a rash of recent celebrity suicides, and the news story, which we talked about on this program a couple of weeks ago, the major story in the New York Times, about how suicide rates in the particularly among white men in the formerly industrial part of the country, but also in Appalachia, across the country, are on a rise. You know, what the heck is going on here? Johann Hari, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Tom. It's great to be back with you.
It's great having you with us. You have not just studied this extensively, but written a brilliant book about it. To what extent do you think that this, you know, there's to broadly categorize kind of endogenous depression, depression that comes from within us, depression that is the result of the consequence of something largely or purely biological. And then there is exogenous depression, depression that is the consequence of things that have happened to us. And maybe, I don't know, a third category, I guess it would fall into exogenous, but maybe depression caused by the way we eat, the way we live, drugs we're taking, whatever. Where are we at? What's the state of depression in America, and what are you finding as a major cause? And that's not even to get into Wilkerson and Pickett's work on how inequality produces depression.
Well, I wanted to understand this for a very personal reason. You know, when I was a teenager, I'd gone to my doctor and I'd explained that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me, that I couldn't control it or regulate it. I felt very ashamed of it. And my doctor told me a story that most of your listeners who've had depression will have been told, an entirely biological story about why I felt this way. My doctor said it was just a problem in my brain. And for 13 years, I took the maximum possible dose of chemical antidepressants that you can. I got a bit of relief from them, but I remained depressed. So I was kind of puzzled by a few mysteries, really. Why was I still depressed when I was doing everything I was being told to do by my doctor, by the culture? And also, you know, I'm 39 years old. The bigger mystery was, every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased across the Western world, and particularly here in the United States. And obviously the suicide rate is one of the most terrible indicators at the extreme edge of that. So I ended up going on this big journey across the world. I wanted to meet the leading experts about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, and just people with very different perspectives all over the world. And I learned lots of things, but I learned there's actually scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. Well, my doctors told me that there's biological factors in depression isn't wrong. There are real biological factors that can make depression worse. But what I learned is actually only 2 of the factors that are causing depression and anxiety to rise so much are biological. The rest are factors in the way we live. And I go through them, obviously, in my book, Lost Connections. And once you understand what these causes are, it opens up a very different set of solutions. And obviously, I can go through some of the specific causes, but I think at the heart of it, for many of these causes, not all, is everyone listening to your show knows they've got natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took any of those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built, this very neoliberal culture, is getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs that people have. And I think that's at the heart of why this epidemic of suicide and depression and anxiety is rising year after year. And that opens up a very different set of solutions that I've seen being tried all over the world that deal with these deep underlying causes.
For example?
Well, I'll give you one example. We are the loneliest society there has ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could call on in a crisis? And when they started doing this study years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. There are more people who have nobody to turn to than any other option.
Wow.
And we are, as human beings, a social species. We evolved to live in tribes. In the circumstances where we evolved, if you were cut off and separated from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for a really good reason. You were about to die, right? These are our natural physical impulses. So I wanted to figure out, there's a lot of evidence. Professor John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago is one of the leading figures showing this, that that loneliness causes depression and anxiety. So I wanted to find out, well, what's the antidepressant for that, right? What can we do about that? And one of the heroes of my book, Lost Connections, is a doctor who pioneered an approach based on this. Sam Everington is a doctor in a poor part of East London, where I'm from in Britain. And Sam was very uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants, but he could see that on their own they were not solving the problem. He decided to pioneer a different approach. There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was just kind of like scrubland where dogs would go and mess. And one day a woman came to him called Lisa Cunningham, who had been shut away in her home with terrible depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to do something else. I'm going to prescribe you to take part in a group. This area behind the surgery, what I'd like you to do is turn up a couple of times a week with other depressed and anxious people. I'm going to turn out with you, and we're going to turn this area into something beautiful. The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But a couple of things happened as the weeks and months passed. First thing was, the people in that program decided they realized they had something to talk about that wasn't how bad they felt. They decided they were going to learn gardening. They were going to turn this into a beautiful garden. These were inner city people that didn't know anything about gardening. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence. Exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. Even more powerfully, they started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to look after each other and care about each other and notice when they weren't there. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. And this is something I saw in the research for my book, Lost Connections, all over the world, from San Francisco to Sydney to Sao Paulo. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're depressed and anxious in the first place. And that requires us to explain to people, if you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy. You're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love, support, and lots of practical help to get those deeper needs met. And I go through my book, Lost Connections, obviously lots of different ways we can do that. But there is evidence from all over the world that these strategies work.
How effective are these sorts of things? We're talking with Johann Hari, the author of Lost Connections. How effective are these strategies for people who have been told, well, like yourself? I mean, for years you struggled with depression. You were told that it was just a chemical imbalance. I get whenever. For example, whenever there's a school shooting and it's been shown that the kid was taking an antidepressant, particularly the SSRIs, which are black boxed for suicide, and there seems to be a correlation between taking SSRI drugs and this loss of affect, which might lead somebody to not view the people they're shooting as actual human beings. And whenever we talk about that, I get all these people calling in going, I was terribly depressed, I was suicidal, I started on Prozac, and I've been great for the last 2 years. Speak to that.
Yeah, I think we need to think about chemical antidepressants a bit differently to how we have up to now. Chemical antidepressants give real relief to some people. They gave me some relief, but they didn't solve the problem for me. They gave me some relief, but they didn't solve the problem. All the long-term research into chemical antidepressants suggests I was quite normal. About 65% of people given these drugs, if you look at the long-term research, do become depressed again. Doesn't mean the drug didn't give some help. Doesn't mean there isn't a significant number of people who are given help. But it's not solving the problem for most of us, as you can see from the fact that, we've had 30 years of every year prescribing more and more antidepressants, and every year depression has continued to rise. Doesn't mean the drugs haven't given some help. It's just not enough to solve the problem. One of the people who really helped me to think differently about this was this wonderful South African psychiatrist I went to interview called Derek Summerfield. Dr. Summerfield happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodian doctors, had never heard of these drugs. So he explained what they were. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy or something. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who one day stood on a landmine and got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg, and he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently, it's very painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial leg. I'm guessing it's pretty traumatic for obvious reasons. The guy started to cry all day, didn't want to get out of bed. Classic depression, right? They said to Derek, Dr. Summerfield, so we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, well, what? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was causing him so much distress. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Derek, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds crazy, right? You know, I went to my doctor for an antidepressant, he gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, like I say, you're not crazy. We've got to understand the deep underlying factors that are driving up this depression, anxiety, and suicide epidemic. The biology of human beings in the United States did not change in the last 30 years, right? We didn't suddenly all have defective brains just spontaneously. What happened is a whole range of social factors that cause depression and anxiety have increased. I go through the science and lost connections. If you go to work tomorrow and you have low or no control over your work, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious. If you had a traumatic childhood and you haven't been given a place where you can release the shame that that causes in people, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious and much more likely to commit suicide. If you're acutely lonely, there's a whole range of these options, a whole range of these causes that I go through for which there's very strong scientific evidence. And talking about just the biology is real. Of course, your genes can make you more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. There are real changes in the brain that begin once you become depressed that can make it somewhat harder to get out.
Johann, we're out of time. Hang on just a second.